Hello, my name is Murat Schippers, and today I would like to share with you an overview of my master's thesis entitled Nocturnal Musings, Analyzing and Recontextualizing the Intricate Piano Harmonies of Marc Copland on the album Night Whispers. The musical element that has always fascinated me the most is harmony, and I love the sensation of discovering surprising harmonic turns that I hadn't heard before. When I became aware of Night Whispers, I was right away fascinated by its sound and Copland's harmonic approach, especially on his rendition of So What that does away with Bill Evans's classic chord structures we know from the original recording, which seemed like quite a radical step to me. Marc Copland is an American jazz pianist born in 1948 who first made a name for himself as a saxophone player in the 70s. After becoming discontented with the limitations of the instrument, he re-emerged in the New York City jazz scene in his 30s as a pianist after having developed a remarkably unique harmonic language. The 2009 album Night Whispers with Drew Grass on double bass and Bill Stewart on drums is extremely focused on a particular sound, which is very hard to put into words. Terms like nocturnal, misty, moody come to mind. To finally gain an understanding of what makes this album in particular and Copland's approach in general special and relevant to a modern musician, I decided to dedicate this research to it. Despite Copland working with musicians of the highest caliber during his more than 5-decade-long career, the academic community seemingly has not picked up on Copland, or at least not incorporated him into artistic research projects. That's why, apart from transcribing music, some investigation was in order to come up with other sources. I sought out interviews with Copland and conducted one myself with him and one of his collaborators to be able to get a closer look. To structure this research, I set the following research questions. What are the core elements of Marc Copland's harmonic expression on Night Whispers, and what might have influenced them? As a second step, to move away from the analytic realm into more creative areas and to find applications for my own professional practice, I let myself be guided by these considerations. Can those elements be made to work in other contexts than the classic acoustic jazz trio? And how can I incorporate these elements into my music in a creative way? This project, taking place in the realm of artistic research, is quite multifaceted and required a certain level of flexibility in approach. Because there were neither academic texts nor music transcriptions available, the groundwork was established through what could be described as elements of an exploratory research design. Overall, however, the iterative cyclic web, as introduced by Smith and Dean, offers a comprehensive way to integrate the various paths of creative exploration into a model that is compatible with academic standards. In this model, we can see overlapping processes between academic and artistic research and how they are related to each other. By this model, creative practice and its research results can be included in the academic world. As Smith and Dean write, terms such as practice-led research have been developed by creative practitioners to argue, as forcefully as possible in an often unreceptive environment, that they are as important to the generation of knowledge as more theoretically, critically, or empirically based research methods. In the following, I will guide you through some of the steps I undertook during this research journey, though for time constraints I'll leave out some here, and I would like to invite you to have a look at my thesis for more details. In order to answer my first research question, I employed various methods. I interviewed Copland for first-hand information, I searched for further interviews, transcribed sections from Night Whispers to have concrete musical material, and transcribed excerpts of Bill Evans and Herbie Hancock's recordings for comparison. First research steps led me to Pablo Hell's interview with Copland. I would heartily recommend it to anyone for a great introduction to Marc Copland, his work and his collaborations. Among the things I've gathered from this interview were Copland's admiration for Bill Evans and Herbie Hancock, Joni Mitchell, his contemporaries Ralph Towner and John Abercrombie, and it was the first time I heard of a certain book which subsequently popped up in other interviews as well.
And one of the books I like a great deal, you may know of it, I don't know if we've ever talked about it, but it's called The Shaping Forces in Music by Ernst Tuch. And I remember I used to read that chapter on harmony 2-3 times a week when I was 17 years old before I went to sleep. I was just like, this is so cool.
I met Marc Copland when I was young, like I was 18, I guess, and when I first met him, and we played together. And he hit me to this book by Ernst Toch called "Shaping Forces in Music," and there's a chapter there on harmony.
The Shaping Forces in Music by Ernst Toch. The book consists of lectures held by Toch, a neoclassical and atonal music composer in the 1940s. It was created out of the want of a textbook which offered a set of guidelines for classical as well as modern music composition. He felt the approved classical guidelines were not able to be applied to contemporary music, or even worse, could be misused for discrediting contemporary music, and were even lacking at explaining certain phenomena in the classical canon as well. The central message of the chapter Copland mentioned is Toch arguing for the linearity of harmony. In his view, voice leading was too often taught as a means of achieving preconceived harmony, while he advocates for a broader view where each melody possesses linear self-preservation. In Toch's opinion, the traditional harmonic writing stifles movement of the voices because they have to stay for common tones that are required to create preconceived harmony. The truth is that the melodic impulse is primary and always preponderates over the harmonic, that the melodic or linear impulse is the force out of which germinates not only harmony, but also counterpoint and form. He defines harmony as a momentary situation brought about by moving voices, the cross-section arising at times of arrested motion. And again later, harmony, consonance and dissonance, they are all the same substance or phenomenon or idea, arrested motion. What's the link to Marc Copland there? The focus on linear motion is echoed in several statements by Copland in interviews, and it seems to have been a central idea in his development of his understanding of music. During our conversation, he referenced shaping forces in music in the following way.
What it is to me is about the process of hearing, improvising as like an ongoing chorale, so to speak, with a soprano and a bass, like Tuck talks about, and filling in the middle with voices that have independent motion.
Further on in the chapter, Toch cites a short passage from Strauss's Rosenkavalier, where several triad chords are played high over a resting F-sharp major chord. Toch suspects the existence of different harmonic streams as the genesis of this passage, writing, "It would be absurd to relate what goes on in the upper register to the harmonies sustained in the lower." This way of thinking also surfaces in Copland's piano playing, where often a string of harmonies happen in the right hand, while the left hand stays inside the changes of the composition. One of those places is a moment during Emily, where Copland stacks a C major 7, D major 7 and F major 7 sharp 5 over a ringing C sharp major structure in the left hand. Even later in the chapter, Toch widens the scope of sources for harmony. While the previous examples mostly come from the traditional method of stacking thirds to build chords, Toch now turns his attention towards other intervals such as fourth and fifths, perfect and augmented. Even a cursory glance at the transcriptions of Night Whispers reveals that Copland might have gotten encouragement here. Quartal and fifth voicings reappear multiple times throughout the recording. Copland, as a jazz pianist, combines Toch's impulses with improvisation. This allows spontaneous, unplanned harmonic movements, which requires a strong focus on the ear. I contacted Copland in February of 2024 and was able to talk to him for an hour via video call. During the conversation, Copland shared some of his childhood influences in classical music, who are as vast as Shostakovich, Prokofiev and Debussy, that were part of his mother's record collection. Later, through high school friends, he learned of Sibelius, Vaughan Williams, and eventually Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, of which 17-year-old Copland bought a score of to investigate. Another source of inspiration were the Beatles. Concerning role models from the jazz world, very specifically Copland mentioned 2 tracks from a Herbie Hancock live recording called Dedication that for him exemplify a successful way of making use of Toch's principles in the jazz idiom. During his time as a saxophonist, He was a student at Lenny Tristano's studio who, in his lessons, focused on sharpening his students' ears. In an interview from 2023 with Jake Feinberg, Copland summarizes the experience in more general terms.
He taught me a way to figure out how to train the neuromuscular network and the inner ear to really be a tool to create musically. That's the best way I can state it.
He phrases it in another way in an email from 2025. The only result I'm interested in is to train and strengthen the links between the internal, what I'm seeing and hearing inside my brain, and the external, the instrument, the framework for improvisation, whether tune or free, and how other musicians in the band are playing and reacting. If the neural pathways between internal and external are working well, then the band can make a strong organic statement. Improvisation is the core factor in Copland's harmony, and because of its spontaneous and fleeting nature, certain processes are difficult if not impossible to put into words. The improvisation is not without rules, of course, and follows the flow of voices in a choral arrangement. This interview at the latest illustrates the fundamental difficulty of this research. There's a certain intangibleness to his approach by design. How does one grasp it and put it into a system? To specify and evaluate harmonic events, sometimes the horizontal flow of voices must be frozen in time and inspected from a vertical perspective. That's why, after this background information gathered, I moved on to musical analysis. After having collected a sufficient amount of transcribed material from Night Whispers, I started assembling a list of the most prominent repeated harmonic devices that I found. It is important to acknowledge that the categorization of these devices removes context and therefore never fully represents the essence of Copland's oeuvre. It can, however, function as a reference point for comparative analysis and, as I will demonstrate later in the results, can be used as a point of departure for creative endeavors. I am going to highlight a few of these instances that I named Coplandisms now to show how I worked. Cluster chords. A dense chord containing minor or major second rubs. Diminished octatonic harmony. Intervals, arpeggios or chords that stem from a whole tone, halftone or diminished scale. Non-diatonic thirds, sixths. The interval of a minor or major third or sixth, played simultaneously or successively, where one or both of the notes do not belong in the parent scale of the harmony. Polytonality, polymodality. Two different harmonic worlds stacked onto each other, often separated by left and right hand on the piano. Stacked sixths. Two pairs of minor or major sixths with varying intervals in between them are played simultaneously. Often, between two of the four notes, a minor second or an octavation of it is created. With this music glossary at hand, when looking at transcriptions of the Herbie Hancock tracks from Dedication, it was now easier to draw comparisons and find possible points of harmonic influence. In my interview with Copland, he speaks highly of Hancock's harmonic concepts.
The way he's going with the harmonies, he's not thinking this chord, that chord, this chord, that chord. He's more thinking, that was Bill. Bill was this chord, this voicing, this substitution, and they were great. But those two tracks, that's where I heard, for me, that kind of approach.
Let's have a quick look at two examples. Hancock opens the rendition of his composition Maiden Voyage with a 6-note right-hand ostinato, which reels between the worlds of D-flat major and minor. It is contrasted by a motive in the left hand that reaches its highest note on E flat when the right lands on an E, creating a minor second rub. Eventually, the figure and motive are developed and settle into the rhythmic opening riff of the composition in the key of D flat. Already we recognize several elements from the music glossary. For example, the ostinato, polymodality, major versus minor, and minor second rubs that are essential for cluster chords. In Hancock's rendition of Dolphin Dance, quite a few movements stood out to me as Coplandish. At 1 minute 10, Hancock's use of chordal voicings that move in constant structure for a moment before ending on a dense D dominant chord evokes what we hear on Night Whispers 35 years later. The final dominant chord's upper structure is a diminished shape that shows up often in Copland's playing. It can also be seen as a G-sharp minor upper structure interlocked with the underlying D dominant 7 and creates a minor second rub with the minor 7th of the chord. Only a few seconds later at 132, two more harmonic motions that bear close connections to Coplandism surface. Deviating from the original recording, two target notes of the melody are reharmonized with augmented chords. Copland employs augmented colors often as upper structures, as we can see in the musical glossary. To illustrate the first augmented sound, E flat, which for added grit still has the perfect fifth as part of the chord voicing as well, Hancock uses 4-6, D B flat, B G, F D flat, D B flat in a mid-high register. This move is highly reminiscent of Copland's non-diatonic sixths, especially in the tune The Bell Tolls. To answer the research questions 2 and 3, some practical exploration was in order. Most of Marc Copland's music has been recorded on an acoustic grand piano. I asked him about playing other keyboard instruments in our conversation, but apart from pointing towards one of the very few albums he plays a string synthesizer on, he says,
I don't really have an interest in doing that. You know, what I like is a nice, fat, mellow acoustic piano sound,
As someone who enjoys involving various keyboard sounds into their creative practice, my interest was piqued to experiment combining these with elements from Night Whispers. I wrote a short composition entitled Croplands as a vehicle, incorporating several Coplandisms in the process, starting with an acoustic trio version to have a reference point. In the electric trio version of the composition, the acoustic piano is switched out for a Fender Rhodes sound and the upright bass is changed to an electric bass. The electric bass and Rhodes have a much more similar tone than upright bass and grand piano, the unison lines prove not as effective, if not overbearing, and some of the sonic interest therefore got lost. Overall, this path still seems viable though. In the organ trio version, the bass is replaced by the Hammond organ player's left hand, as is tradition in the organ trio setup. Unlike the standard lineup organ, guitar and drums, here a soprano saxophone takes over the melody and replaces the guitar to avoid harmonic clashes. As the melody is now given to the high-pitched soprano saxophone with its overtone-rich sonic qualities, the melody shines through in absolute clarity. For the majority of the chords, voicings have been put in a closed position to accommodate playing with only the right hand. To make this more playable, doubled notes were eliminated and melody notes have been mostly omitted. After its rearrangement, the organ trio version of Copland's still works fairly well. As the bass does not possess a body as powerful as an acoustic bass, the track tends to feel slightly empty when the left hand plays its answer to the main melody. Especially the low fifths fail to create the same excitement as in the acoustic version. During the walking bass section, the balance is more even. For the organ duo version, several compromises had to be made. With the left hand assuming its role from the previous version, almost all chord voicings had to be realized by the right hand, which also had to transport the melody. This presented various challenges, as certain 5-note voicings from the organ trio version were just not playable anymore, coming out of the melodic line. Overall, the emptiness is much more pronounced in this version, to the extent that the harmonic content sounds too minimal. The bass fifths sound dull and fail to transport dynamic interest. As the final step, I devised 2 versions of Copland's recorded purely with synthesizers. As swung jazz with synthesizers is quite rare, I replaced the underlying groove with a 12/8 rhythm that allows a ternary phrasing comparable to the original version. A synthesizer trio with drums, bass and a single synthesizer sound is a relatively rare occurrence, and this version was meant to be an additional opportunity for comparison with the more common synth arrangement. All in all, the sound of the single synthesizer is much more one-dimensional than that of an acoustic piano, one of the reasons being the fixed dynamic response of the keyboard. One advantage of the synthesizer bass is that lower notes become available. Low Ds and D flats that are only playable on a 5-string electric bass are easily in reach of the oscillator's extreme frequency range. This version comes a little closer to what synthesizers are most often used for in music production. Various sounds take on specialized roles. The melody is taken over by a monophonic lead voice, similar to the soprano saxophone in the organ trio version. A warm synth pad sound with a slow attack and a longer release plays long chords, providing a steady carpet of harmonic information. To support the melody, a more brilliant sound with fast attack doubles the synth's lead's rhythm and provides extra clarity during the kicks in bars 11 through 13. With these clearly defined roles and not too much overlap, the sonic image of Copland's becomes fleshed out while staying transparent. Hearing the Coplandish harmonies in a pure synthesized context is a little unusual at first, but I think with further fine-tuning, a sound could be reached that's a little less, let's call it whimsical, but also doesn't fit too much into the mold of 80s fusion jazz. As one way to internalize and make use of the gained insight on Copland's harmonic language, I decided to apply as many different techniques listed in the music glossary as possible. As you probably suspected, this really was an exercise to use a song from the Great American Songbook in an original piano arrangement. I chose the composition It's Only a Paper Moon. I went at it with a quite analytic approach, starting with the bare melody, then later smoothing over with intuition and taste. With the focus on voice leading as the guiding principle, I went back through the arrangement and inserted Coplandisms in parts where the musical interest seemed lacking. The reharmonization of a jazz standard using elements out of the musical glossary of Coplandisms in a modular fashion works well. One reason for that is the malleability of the source material, which leaves plenty of room for new harmonies. For a composition with more elaborate harmony, it might be more difficult, and indeed on some of the records where Copland is a sideman, he plays a, let's say, lighter level of reharmonization. As I was writing a big band composition while working on this thesis, I chose to make it a part of my explorations and test if certain harmonic elements of Copland's harmonies could be applied in the context of writing for a large ensemble. For the second movement of my composition, Three Tiles, I chose the stacked sixths as an impetus for composition. The exposition of the first motive is delivered by the piano, which is in the jazz trio style of Night Whispers, is only accompanied by bass and drums. The stacked sixths harmonizing the first melody in constant structure are a minor sixth on top and a major sixth on the bottom, set apart by a minor sixth. After that, the stacked sixths are transferred to the reed section, who, with their available doublings, create a much softer and more diffuse version of the same musical idea. Flute and alto flute take the upper sixth, while alto sax and clarinet play the lower one. Due to the instruments' respective ranges, this time the upper sixth is transposed down an octave. To soften the impact of the dissonant voicings in the overtone-rich woodwind environment, and at the same time to create rhythmic interest as the section plays unaccompanied, the lower sixth is first displaced by an eighth note. After the solo section, the sixth idea returns in the trumpet section, albeit in a closer voiced version. Trumpets 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are coupled and play the melody in interlocking sixth voicing. Some oblique motions in trumpets 2 and 4 is added to prohibit the motive becoming stale. The same idea can also be implemented into the low brass. In a short melodic section from bar 202, the trombones follow a similar pattern, although the section's ambitus is increased to a minor tenth to minimize problems with the lower interval limits. Concluding, we can see that making use of a small idea out of Copland's harmonic vocabulary made it possible to create a new piece of music for a large ensemble which bears an idiomatic signature without sounding plagiarized. Marc Copland being influenced by a neoclassical composer, modern jazz piano greats, impressionist painters, and the music of Joni Mitchell, picking and choosing elements from their creation to piece together his own way of approaching his art, underwent an almost canonic protocol in the world of jazz, encapsulated in trumpeter Claude Terry's formula emulate, assimilate, innovate. The outcome, his harmonic expression, is however extremely personalized and recognizable. Some of the benefits that I've enjoyed through working on this thesis are expanding my musical hearing through the challenging transcription work necessary, finding new inspiration and motivation for composing, with the focus on horizontal voice movement, gaining more confidence in writing harmony that goes beyond a chord symbol or is not easily expressible with one. The idea of color over function opens up new possibilities in composing and playing. What can one take away from this? Taking harmonic concepts like Copland's and combining them with the new sounds and rhythmic idioms of hip-hop, electronica and neo-soul remains to be a large field of experimentation and discovery. Creative processes can be triggered from places that would seem dry and overly theoretical in the first moment, like my musical glossary, which for me proved to be a great source of creativity. For composers and arrangers, the transfer of Copland's ideas to bigger ensembles also opens up exciting alleys. The 3 wind sections of the big band, for example, provide the flexibility to cover Copland's harmonic idioms with the necessary amount of complexity, but they add exciting new timbres. For educators, how can a linear horizontal view be taught to a music student, and what assistance can the teacher give? At which point should it be taught in the student's educational career? Night Whispers is a fascinating album making use of a recognizable and idiomatic sound color that, astonishingly, after almost a year and a half of work, remains hard to put into words. Can the music glossary begin to grasp these mysterious moods? I have conflicting feelings about the cataloging of the Coplandisms. In addition to the possibility of omitting details and context, there is the danger of forcing things into categories for which they are not suited, a fact already lamented by Ernst Toch about music theory and the shaping forces of music. Compared to the intuitive way the music was created, the music glossary represents a certain over-intellectualization. On the other hand, for a novice to Copland, the systematic categorization of his harmonic material could be a valuable starting point, the same way it has helped me refine my harmonic vocabulary. When I asked Copland what he thought of the analytical approach to his music, he replied, "I do analytical stuff all the time, but it is usually on the back end. Using ears and intuition is not random at all. It's the same process as when talking or writing. You need to know and understand the grammar, but a deeper process is driving things when one is spontaneously communicating with words or music. This is the process that needs to be trained and utilized. At least that has been my experience playing, practicing and teaching for 59 years. To me, this statement shows a beautiful confluence of the themes covered in this thesis, while also demonstrating that analysis and following intuition are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, they build upon each other, and proficiency in both domains needs to be cultivated. With this, I'd like to conclude my presentation. Thank you for your attention.